In this section, we're going to be talking about Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So, who is this person and what did he do? Basically, a boat was sent out from England, and its job, they had several jobs in charting and in mapping, but they actually needed a naturalist on the boat. Somebody that would document all of the nature things, the biological things that they saw along the way. And so Darwin actually was chosen to do this, and his job basically was to collect several types of evidence as he traveled along, and he ended up collecting fossils and gathered specimens and kept very detailed journals of his work that he didn't set out to learn anything about natural selection, but this all backed up the theory of evolution and natural selection as he traveled. So it's interesting to read and learn about his background, by the way. But anyways, this is a map of his journey, and we're going to talk a lot about today the Galapagos Islands, which is pretty important to what he did. And if you go to South America and about, I think, where Ecuador is, if you head west and go out, then you'll hit the Galapagos Islands, and they're pretty far out there, although this map isn't really showing it, but they're pretty far away from Ecuador. So he traveled down here and then traveled all the way home on the other side. Um, so as he visited, he did collect specimens, especially like finches, which are small little birds. Kind of noticing that the beaks were different, although it didn't really mean that much to him. But he collected them. He collected dead specimens, and he actually tried to bring home some live specimens. I'm sure some of those became dead specimens by the time he traveled home. Back then, collections for zoos and museums was really different than it is today. Now, if you had zoos really going and pulling animals out of the wild to put them in their zoo, at least a first world country, that would be like extremely frowned upon. Most of the zoo specimens that I know of are usually ones that the country was either marked for, like culled the herd, meaning they're like killing them for meat, and zoos step in and say, hey, we'd like to purchase this and you can use the money to buy your people meat. Or I've seen that some zoos have some animals that were not fit to return after they were confiscated by poachers, and those are sent to zoos. So not very much are animals taken out of the wild anymore, but this was common at the time. So that was done. So he ended up bringing home many different types of specimens of things. And as he got home, he continued to study. And one of the things that he really thought a lot about was artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is basically humans breeding a different species for a certain trait. So an example of that is when I was a little kid, I had dogs called Yorkshire Terriers. And if you've seen Yorkshire Terriers before, like Toto from Wizard of Oz, they're just like small and furry and very loyal and smart and kind of mean sometimes. They're fine. They're great dogs. But I used to wonder when I was a really little kid how they would have survived in the wild. How did these things not get eaten? What they do, hide really well or something? And the fact of the matter is as I've learned more, it's that they never did survive in the wild. They were artificially bred by humans, as many dogs have been, or they were bred for certain traits, that they would have long, non-shedding hair, hypoallergenic, would be small so that they could be like a little lap dog. So these were not natural traits. So it was artificially selected for by humans. And as I get ready to like plant my gardens for this next summer, one of the things that I always plant is, for example, is tomatoes. And with tomatoes, I'm always looking for tomatoes that are like, it's called meaty inside, where it has a lot of fiber, not a lot of juice, so it's good for sandwiches and they're big. Like I like beefsteak tomatoes, or sometimes smaller Roma tomatoes for sauces. And these are all things that humans bred tomatoes for. So Darwin applied this, and he thought that he knew that if humans could influence traits, and if they could have these traits then be inherited, then this could likely happen in nature as well. And so when he got home, he started to develop this theory of natural selection. So soon after he's back from the Galapagos Islands, Darwin formed his theory of natural selection, which is the mechanism for species changing. And there were four important principles that lead to natural selection. And here's a good progression of sunflowers here that we'll show you. So, variation. The first principle is variation, and that's that within one population, you're going to have different organisms that are different from each other, and that these differences can be inherited. So, things being like taller or shorter, that could be inherited. But if I go and just pull some leaves off the sunflower, it's not like I changed its DNA. That's not inherited. So some things are inherited, some things are not. If I go cut my own hair, it doesn't mean all future children that I have will be born with shorter hair, because that's not altering my DNA. It's not making a permanent change. All right, the next thing is that overproduction. There's certain populations, and not all, but certain populations produce way more offspring than will actually survive. So like a sunflower might have thousands of seeds on just one flower, if you've seen a really big sunflower, and clearly they're not all going to plant themselves and become flowers. And so what makes one survive and what makes one not survive, this gives them a reproductive advantage. So I don't know what the example here is with this sunflower, but let's say that this sunflower here that died in this scenario got too tall and too heavy with its seeds, that it buckled over and it died. Okay, so it did not produce seeds to reproduce, and it's the shorter ones that survived here. So variation, heritability, overproduction, and reproductive advantage were the four principles necessary for natural selection. So Darwin also came up with the idea that competition for resources like land or sun or water for these sunflowers, the competition for resources is important, because those with good adaptations will be able to survive, and those without the good adaptations will not survive. And so the ones that survive are more likely to reproduce. So competition for resources basically is pretty important for natural selection. So Darwin begins writing his book called The Origin of Species, and one thing that was an important note from that book is that if there's no variation between organisms, if all of these flowers were literally genetically identical, if there's no variation, then evolution can't really occur. There won't be changes. Now you might say, well, what if there's a mutation? Okay, but then they wouldn't be genetically identical anymore. So if they are always genetically identical, then evolution can't occur. If there's something that goes different in the environment, like a new disease, or maybe there is the environment changes, then the population could completely die, because there's no differences between them that would say one organism would survive better than others. So here are the four examples, basically, of the principles of natural selection. So here they say individuals in a population show variation. That means they're all different, and these differences can be inherited. Some organisms have more young than can survive, and these variation increase your chances of reproductive success. So, in the end, Darwin did end up publishing The Origin of Species. And just an interesting side note that they added down here, but I've always thought this was interesting, is that a lot of people just link Darwin with evolution, but most of his book was all just about these principles, these natural selection principles. He actually only used the word evolution once, and that was on the very last page of his book. The rest of his book was all about just how some organisms are varied, they inherit, they pass down their traits. Some organisms don't survive, and that gives some a reproductive advantage. So that's our Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection.